Today on Know the Truth from Philip DeCourcy.
We've got a subtle enemy, a subtle enemy. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And that's a word that carries the idea of schemes, of someone that's cunning, deceptive, and clever, acting methodically. The devil is a shrewd spiritual strategist.
In war, the last thing you want to do is underestimate your enemy. That's a surefire path to defeat. So today on Know the Truth, pastor and author Philip DeCourcy is taking us on a reconnaissance mission into enemy territory to gather intelligence on the adversary of our faith, Satan and his demons. We'll be taking our marching orders from Ephesians chapter 6 as we continue a series called Armed and Dangerous. Philip has titled today's message, Know Your Enemy. Let's dive in.
The Battle of Antietam took place in 1862, lasted for 12 long hours, and it ranks as one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. When the roar of the cannon fell silent, when the smoke cleared, there were 10,000 Confederate casualties and even more on the Union side. Although it was a military draw, it was a turning point in the war, because up until that point, the Union forces had no real wins against the Confederates. But under a mediocre general, George McClellan, at this point, they pushed the Confederate forces back across the Potomac. And it raises a question: how was it possible? Given McClellan's track record, given the surge of the Confederate forces north. Well, the background to the draw, which was a win in some senses for the Union forces, was that a couple of days earlier, some Union soldiers had found 3 cigars wrapped in a piece of paper. They were really focused on the cigars, not the piece of paper. But as they sat in a field after a skirmish with some Confederate troops, they looked at the piece of paper and realized that they held in their hand Robert E. Lee's plans for Antietam. The cigars and the plans in which they were wrapped had fallen out of the pocket of a Confederate general. And that was the secret to their success that day. That's how the war turned pivotally at that bloody battle. And I think that story reminds us that knowing your enemy is vital to countering and conquering your enemy. Intelligence regarding the strength and strategy of the opposition plays a key role in defeating those who want to defeat us. That's true whether we're talking about a military operation like the Battle of Antietam, but it also holds true if we're talking about football seasons or political campaigns. The depth to which you know your enemy will determine in large measure the breadth of your victory over them. Because to underestimate your enemy is perilous. And so it's not surprising, as we come back to Ephesians chapter 6, that Paul prefaces his teaching on the Christian's armor with a full and a frank discussion of the enemy's strategies and the enemy's strengths. He doesn't want the Ephesians to be ignorant of the devil's plots and plans. If you look at 2 Corinthians 2, verse 11, Paul says that, I don't want you to be ignorant of the devil's schemes. So between his summons to seek the Lord's strength and to put on the armor of God, Paul tells us what we're up against. He doesn't want us to be ignorant, because ignorance of the enemy is to fight with one arm tied behind your back. And it is a fight, by the way, guys. The Christian life is not a walk in the park. It's a wrestling match, according to the Apostle Paul. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. It's the image of the wrestling match. Now, don't be thinking of one of those contrived wrestling matches we see on television with Vince McMahon and his crew. No, Paul has us in the Roman arena. This is the picture of two men locked in hand-to-hand combat, and in some cases, to the death. That's the picture. You see, when you and I commit ourselves to Christ, it's a case of double trouble. Not only do we deal with all the sorrows and challenges that everyone else faces in this life, but we have indeed made an enemy of Satan, and he's committed to our destruction. He goes about seeking whom he may devour. Commitment to Christ results in conflict, war, fighting, not your best life now. You've heard me say this several times from the pulpit. We have the internal struggle with self, we have the external struggle with the world, and we have the infernal struggle with Satan. Now here's another thing, just by way of introduction. I find this interesting. Paul here in Ephesians 6 goes into this lengthy discussion about spiritual warfare. And he introduces Satan as a matter of routine, as he did earlier in the book. When you go back to chapter 2 and verse 2, we read that we once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. In chapter 4, verse 27, he warns us that we're not to give place to the devil. Paul supplies no biography concerning the devil. Paul gives us no account of Satan's origin. He just assumes a certain theological agreement with his readers. There was little persuasion needed on his part towards the church at Ephesus. Because if you go back into the founding of that church, a report is given in Acts chapter 19 by Dr. Luke as he records the history of the early church. You'll find that that was a city infested with demonic activity. You have those who are trying to cast out evil spirits. Then there are those who come to Christ, and we see after that transformation of faith that they indeed burn all their books and the stuff associated with their old life in the black arts and the occult. So Paul and his readers were very familiar with Satan's activity. Satan was a reality to them. And I just want to underscore that fact for all of us. This passage in this book would remind us that Satan is not the product of superstition. Neither is he a symbol for evil. He's a real person with real power. He works in the sons of disobedience. He's looking for a beachhead in our lives so that he can advance with his destructive agenda. Just because something's unseen doesn't mean it's unreal. And I want to remind you and myself that the spiritual realm exists outside the science laboratory. And it lives at a distance to the naked eye. But there is an evil force and an evil figure at work in this world. Jesus Christ, who was the embodiment of truth, tells us to pray to our Heavenly Father in Matthew 6, verse 13, that we would be delivered from the evil one. In John 17, verse 15, he prays for us, having taught us how to pray. In Matthew 6, in John 17, he prays for us that indeed that we again would be protected against the evil one. The devil's a liar. John 8:44. And his greatest lie is to deceive people into thinking he doesn't exist. Then he can do his devilish, diabolical work under the cover of anonymity. If he's not perceived to be a threat, how much destruction can he really do? Because the solving of a problem begins by the identifying of its nature. And that's one of the devil's greatest tricks, to convince the world he doesn't exist so that he can do his work with greater ease. So let's look at our enemy for a few moments. We're just looking at verses 10 through 13, and then starting next month, we're going to look at each part of the armor. But I want to say three things about our enemy. Number one, I want you to see that we have a supernatural enemy. Then number 2, we're going to look at the fact that we have a subtle enemy. And then number 3, we're going to look at we have a strong enemy. And we'll end on a comforting and bracing thought that we can be strong in the power of Christ's might. But let's answer this first thought. We have an enemy that's supernatural. You and I need to understand what we are up against. And the first thing to notice is the nature of the enemy, the nature of the fight that we're in. What does Paul say? We wrestle not against flesh and blood, verse 12. We have a supernatural enemy. Our enemy is unseen, and he's supernatural. He's not seen, he's not human. We fight supernatural powers and personalities. In fact, this phrase, flesh and blood, you'll find it used in Galatians 1 verse 16, where Paul says when God called him to the apostolic ministry, he did not what? Confer with flesh or blood. Remember when Peter confessed the Lord, you're the Son of the living God? And Jesus said what of Peter? Flesh and blood didn't reveal this. My Father in heaven revealed this. What's the implication? That little phrase speaks of human nature. It speaks of other people. So Paul is reminding us that our fight is supernatural because our enemy is supernatural. Our fight is not primarily with people. Put that down. That phrase means human nature or people. Now, let me say this, just by way of qualification. Paul's not letting man off the hook completely. He's acknowledged that fallen human nature is a vast problem. He describes people earlier in this letter as children of disobedience, as objects of God's wrath. So he doesn't give mankind a pass. But he's acknowledging in the bigger picture something more is going on when you see someone disobey, when you see someone act lawlessly, when you see someone flagrantly oppose God's will on earth as God's kingdom comes. That's the bigger picture. There's a sinister figure. There's a menacing force at work in the world that you and I need to be aware of if we're going to understand the nature of the fight. If you're an old military guy or presently serving our country, and we thank you for your past and present service, you know about target acquisition. And what we have in this verse is target acquisition. Do you understand the nature of the fight? Do you understand the nature of the enemy? Here's your target acquisition. It's not really people. It's the menacing figure and the menacing forces that stand behind them. We saw in Job's story that a curtain is pulled back, and we see that there is a relentless, invisible war going on in heaven, over the earth, concerning the souls of men. Satan presents himself to God. He acquires his target, which is Job. And God allows him to trouble Job only to a certain point. But the point I want to just take from that is that we see in that one episode in the Bible, and it's inferred here in Ephesians chapter 6, that history unfolds against the backdrop of a cosmic conflict involving the forces of darkness and God. There's an invisible war going on with spiritual intelligences fighting over the souls of men, opposing the God who sits on the throne of heaven and rules over the earth. We know from the book of Revelation and all the diabolical and demonic activity that will go on in those last days, that at some point in history, in Satan's last hurrah, so to speak, that invisible war will become more visible. But I just want you to underscore, we have a supernatural enemy. Satan is a created, non-physical, finite being whose original purpose was to serve and glorify God as a cherub. Cherubim were gatekeepers of heaven. But Satan betrayed his glorious calling, rose up in bull-faced pride against God, causing a rebellion in heaven that involved a third of the angels. Satan was the original sinner. Our enemy is a malignant and malevolent spiritual power. Here's a couple of implications, right? This is where the rubber hits the road here. I could say more about Satan's bio, but I just want to underscore we have a supernatural enemy. And there's a relentless, invisible war going on. And Paul says you need to nail that down. You do not wrestle with flesh and blood. The enemy, in the scheme of things, is not people. I think that says something about the nature of the war and the weapons we're to fight that war with, and it says something about the nature of the enemy. Guys, I think it would be good to remind ourselves as we look at this passage, by implication, the church of the New Testament was not at war with a pagan, godless Roman government. That was not the calling of the church. They didn't give themselves to a big political plan or agenda. The church didn't fight against slavery, which was a blight on that society. You don't hear a lot of talk about the rights of women within the Roman Empire, which was suppressed because the fight was about the gospel. The fight was centered in the heavenlies. The fight was against demonic intelligences. The fight was over the supremacy of Christ within the church and over the world. That's the nature of the war. And therefore, it has implications about the nature of our weapons. That's why Paul will say in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. Interesting. Our weapons are not to be borrowed from the world. Our weapons are not to be fashioned by human wisdom. According to this text in Ephesians 6, as we work our way through it in succeeding months, our weapons are prayer, faith, truth, integrity, righteousness, hope, evangelism. These are the weapons, according to Paul, with which we must fight. So it says something about the nature of the war, says something about the nature of our weapons, and it says something about the real enemy. As we've said, in the greater scheme of things, people are not the enemy. Now, I find it very tempting. My target acquisition typically moves towards certain political figures, certain trendsetters in our culture, and you and I fall into this trap all the time. Now, don't get me wrong, we have qualified it. They are certainly involved in this. Paul doesn't give them a pass. But you've got to get behind them. You've got to get behind what your eyes see and realize that the fight is wider than that. There's a menacing figure with forces that are manipulating all of this. The enemy's not the gay rights activist or the abortionist or whatever. It's the one who stands behind them. People are not the enemy in the big scheme of things. They're the victims of the enemy. Didn't Paul tell us that in Ephesians 2, verse 2? While he acknowledges that men and women are children of disobedience, children of wrath, but he does preface that, you has he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sin, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. We read in 2 Timothy 2, verse 26, that those without Jesus Christ are held captive by the evil one at his will. The devil blinds, he cheats, and he kills. Satan is the godfather of sin. He's the original sinner, as we just said. And so we need to see people as sheep without a shepherd and at the mercy of Satan, the roaring lion. In a helpful book I've been consulting by Ray Stedman, who used to preach up in the San Francisco area. In his book, Spiritual Warfare, he tells of hearing about a mental hospital that devised an unusual test to determine whether someone should be released from the institution back into society. And the test went something like this. They would bring the candidate into a room, and then they would turn on a faucet, and the water would pour all over the floor. And then they would hand the patient a mop and tell him to mop up the water. The patient had the sense to turn the faucet off before they mopped up the water. They might be given an indication they were in their right mind, they were in touch with reality, and it might be safe enough to release them back into society. But those that spent moment by moment, minute by minute, hour by hour just mopping up the water, they were out of touch with reality. And we might laugh at that, says Ray Stedman. And yet he said this, quote, I'm afraid we're laughing at ourselves because that's what many of us are doing. Each Christian facing the personal world in which he lives is given the map of truth and told to use it. But we can only help in that world if we have enough intelligence to conquer first the evil which is pouring into our hearts from those world rulers of present darkness. I think he makes a good point. I want you to see that we have a supernatural enemy. Number two, we've got a subtle enemy. A subtle enemy. Let's go back to our text in Ephesians 6. Let's look at verse 11 now. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord, the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. So we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against spiritual entities and intelligences, a spiritual intelligence, Satan himself, and we are up against his wiles. And that's a word that carries the idea of schemes, methods. It's used negatively in extra-biblical literature of someone that's cunning, deceptive, and clever. In fact, you'll find it used in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14. We should no longer be children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men in the cunning craftiness, there's our word, of deceitful plotting. But it also can speak in a neutral sense of acting methodically. Acting methodically. It speaks of carefully laid out plans. So let's give it a little bit of a military twist, because that's the context here in Ephesians chapter 6. What Paul is talking about here is a military picture that embraces the idea of a well-planned attack, one which is varied, clever, deceptive, and poses a real threat. That's what we're up against. The devil is a shrewd spiritual strategist. Now here's the deal. This is a wake-up call. He's been sharpening his diabolical skills for millennium. So this isn't an easy fight. He's long in the tooth when it comes to spiritual warfare. His playbook is thick and well-worn. He's a crafty old devil.
Learning to discern the subtle and subversive techniques of our adversary. That's our goal today on Know the Truth as we continue our study through Ephesians 6. Philip DeCourcy's titled today's message, Know Your Enemy, and is part of our series called Armed and Dangerous. Spiritual warfare is one of those topics that's easy to forget or overlook. It's not something we can see with our eyes, and as the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. But as Philip explained today, when we underestimate our enemy, we leave ourselves open to attack. So I hope you'll continue joining us every day. And one of the best ways to stay up to date is by signing up for the free daily podcast. You can do that through Apple or Google Podcasts or learn more at ktt.org. We love providing these daily messages without cost being a barrier, and we're committed to reaching as many people as we can with the truth of Scripture. But none of this would be possible without the partnership of listeners like you. If Philip's teaching has been a blessing in your life, will you link arms with us by donating today? When you do, we'll express our gratitude for your support by sending you a fascinating book titled Spiritual Warfare in the End Times. It's a perfect companion to our current series, diving into the identity, tactics, and dominion of Satan, so you can be prepared to stand fast. In addition to the book, we'll also send you a brand new study card from Philip called This Means War, featuring scriptural insights from the Armed and Dangerous series. Request both resources when you donate today. That's 888-644-8811, or give online at ktt.org. If you prefer to mail your gift, our address is Know the Truth, Post Office Box 30250, Anaheim Hills, California, 92809. I'm your host, Wayne Shepherd, for Philip DeCourcy. Tomorrow we'll continue evaluating the tactics of our spiritual enemy, so be sure to join us again Tuesday on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."